This episode of The History Guy brought to you by Magellan TV. In the 13th century, an English monk complained that winter is cold and moist, but in winter coldness holds more mastery than moisture, because then is a great binding and freezing of the air and water. For all the great mastery of the sun, winter is all contrary to summer. Whether harsh or mild, winter in the northern climates of Europe and Asia and North America brings ice and snow, and for medieval peasants, winter was a particularly difficult time, but some winters were more difficult than others. In the 15th century, a series of particularly harsh winters over the decade of the 1430s caused famine, exacerbated disease, and changed culture. The Bleak Midwinter of the 1430s is history that deserves to be remembered. The Bleak Midwinter reminds us that people in medieval Europe simply faced challenges differently than we do today, and only part of that is because of developments in technology. In the new Magellan series, Medieval Lives, historian Helen Castor explains how the people of the Middle Ages handled the most fundamental moments of transition in life: birth, marriage, and death. And in doing so, she reveals how people in the medieval world thought and what they believed in. I've talked to you about Magellan TV, a true hidden treasure that is a rising star in the streaming world and the highest-rated documentary streaming app on Google Play. The reason that Magellan TV is so special is all about the drama of real life, the lives of ancient pharaohs, or critical battles in the world wars, or soldiers who fought in the Civil War, and the battles for the control of the English crown, or the Norman conquest. In my opinion, Magellan TV has the largest and best collection of history shows anywhere. Run by documentary filmmakers, Magellan TV really is the best value of all these premium documentary streaming services that are out there today, both in price and in quality. Heck, Magellan TV adds more than 20 hours of new documentaries every single week. I watch it all the time, and History Guy viewers can get a special offer of a month-long free trial by going to try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Sign up today, and you can watch Medieval Lives, Birth, Marriage, Death, and the rest of the Magellan TV history collection. And don't forget that Magellan TV also sells gift cards, which allows you to give the very special gift of TV that is worth watching. It's great for the holidays and any occasion. The so-called Little Ice Age was a period of largely regional cooling, especially in Europe and around the Atlantic. There is considerable disagreement about when the Ice Age began, with conventional definitions spanning from the 16th to the 19th century, but while others date the beginning to be earlier, to around 1300. Certainly there is some evidence of cooling by 1300 as Atlantic pack ice began to grow around 1250. Around 1300, summers began becoming less dependable and showed greater variation in rainfall, while the Baltic Sea froze over twice in 1303 and 1306. Advancing ice from the Arctic eventually froze out Norse communities in Greenland, with the last written records dating from around 1408. By 1410, Greenland was largely cut off by ice in the ocean for several hundred years. Whether it was part of the Little Ice Age or not, the early 15th century saw a period of extremely cold winters that would have a serious impact on European life. In the book The Little Ice Age, archaeologist Dr. Brian Fagan describes the period. The climate became more unpredictable, cooler, occasionally stormy, and subject to sporadic extremes. Among the more dramatic was the winter of 1407 and 1408, the Great Frost and Ice. Chroniclers called it the coldest winter in living memory, and the North Sea was frozen enough that people crossed between Denmark and Norway on horseback. Today's modern and global shipping system means that for much of the world, famine is a thing of the past. For most people in modern wealthy countries, food comes from a grocery store, and very little, if anything, is grown in home gardens. But as French historian Ferdinand Braudel states, the world between the 15th and 18th century was one of vast peasantry, where between 80 and 90% of the people lived from the land and nothing else. The rhythm, quality, and efficiency of harvest ordered all material life. These medieval farmers relied on subsistence farming, rarely had a surplus or a reliable way of keeping it for more than a short time. Crop disasters nearly always meant hunger. From 1300 on, the seasons in Europe were not uniformly bad, nor were they uniformly good, but cycles of warmer and cooler summers, of wet springs, and extreme heat waves. The most extreme famine struck between 1315 and 1319, but local famines were not uncommon. This is all added to other general medieval problems: disease, poor hygiene, and endemic warfare. As the decade of the 1430s dawned, the Hundred Years' War was in its final phase. Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians at the end of May. But 1430 also brought with it an incredible cold spell with exceptionally harsh winters. Climatologist Hubert Lamb, using botany, historical document research, and meteorology, concluded that the decade of the 1430s was one of the two coldest episodes of the last millennium. Causes are less clear, but contemporary records unanimously describe severe winters across the continent. In the winter of 1431-32, extreme cold in France, Britain, and Western Europe caused significant frost damage to vineyards in Britain and France. In 1431, a Venetian ship encountered extreme northeasterly winds on its way to Bruges, which blew them for 10 days and forced the ship hundreds of miles off course. The sailors abandoned the ship the day after Christmas and miraculously reached Norway in a small boat in January. History in the 1430s combined in numerous other ways to exacerbate the problems. In addition to the Hundred Years' War, conflict in Hungary, Czechia, Switzerland, and Bologna forced peasants to take shelter in cities. After a dramatic decrease in population thanks to the Black Death, population in the early 15th century is estimated to have remained fairly steady, but the loss of farmland caused a surge in food prices, and a famine that nearly matched the 1315 Great Famine occurred between 1433 and 1438. In England, colder temperatures devastated the wine industry, which had been brought by the Romans but nearly disappeared by 1440. 6 out of 10 harvests in the 1430s failed in England, and deaths in sheep flocks were reported to be at 30%, compared to a usual 4 or 5%, devastating the wool trade. Crop failures reported across the continent for at least 6 of the 10 years of the 1430s in Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Bohemia. In the winter of 1432, Scottish chroniclers recorded that wine had to be melted before it could be drunk. Modern studies of lake sediment, ice cores, and tree rings have illuminated the situation more, suggesting a series of at least 7 years of extraordinary winters, with generally normal summers. 1432 seems to have had a particularly warm summer, while the summers of 1436 and 1438 were abnormally cool. Warm summers couldn't make up for the extremely harsh winters. The first half of the decade in Italy were marked by death and harvest failures, and winters in southern France and northern Italy were reported to last until May. South of the Alps, extraordinarily wet years added to the destruction. In Eastern Europe, the Danube was reported to flood significantly 6 years in the 1430s. In London, writers remarked that laurel, sage, and thyme were destroyed by late frosts, along with a shortage of coal and firewood. In Germany and the Low Countries, 1436 saw reports of frozen vineyards, devastated winter grain, and damages to livestock. The period saw trade routes interrupted as roads became impassable, and lakes and rivers throughout Central Europe froze over in the winter. The extreme cold was felt across northwestern Europe, as well as Central and Eastern Europe, and even as far south as southern France. These came with extremely low spring temperatures in 1432, 1433, and 1435, and significant late frosts in April and May. Especially bad were frosts in 1437 at the end of March and in the second half of May. Reports of outstandingly cold winters in southeastern France were reported in the 1430s. Food prices soar throughout the decade across Europe, from the Czech lands and Hungary to Scotland and Ireland. In the second half of the 1430s, prices rose to dizzying heights in the Holy Roman Empire and the Low Countries. By 1435, wheat was expensive enough in England that peasants were making bread from fern roots. Famine spread across the continent, and in 1438, one chronicler wrote that there was such a dearness and famine in the entire Netherlands that one did not know how to complain about poverty and moan on misery. Wet winters might also have contributed to a variety of illnesses and diseases, such as ergot fungus, known as St. Anthony's fire, and respiratory diseases. Peasants, whose malnourishment became acute in this period, were likely at heightened risk. Peasant life in general was badly disrupted. Already difficult extreme winters and poor harvests made it even harder for the peasant family to stay fed throughout the cold months. Few had glass or anything else in windows, which they instead blocked off however they could, often with paper or something similar. Peasants generally left a fire burning in the center of the room and brought farm animals indoors to share the heat. Stones or bricks were heated in the fire before bed, wrapped in sheets and left in bed with them to keep them warm. As prices soared and the famine became acute, European governments attempted to stop the flow of grain. The English crown issued an export ban in September 1438 to stop Netherlands and English traders from selling grain to starving cities along the coasts of the North Sea. In 1434, Hungary banned exports in an attempt to prevent a famine. The Netherlands and the Teutonic states in the Baltic enacted similar bans. In Switzerland, Zurich excluded 2 cities from the grain trade, which caused the Old Zurich War. Cultural effects of this long period of harsh winters extended even further. In Bologna, citizens formed a cult of Madonna di San Luca as a direct reaction to continuous rainfall from April to June in 1433. In the Holy Roman Empire, several instances are recorded of local populations blaming minorities for their perceived part in harvest failures and long winters. Romani were repeatedly blamed, and Romani were discriminated against as witches with magical powers. Jewish populations saw blame as well, with many towns expelling their Jewish populations in the 1430s. General anti-Semitism was already a problem in Europe, but accusations of usury and the hoarding of food to sell for profit became common. Especially frightening for medieval people was the threat of witches who were suspected of weather-making. More positively, the lean days of the 1430s saw numerous towns such as London, Cologne, and Strasbourg build communal granaries in an effort to prevent food shortages. Towns attempted to bring in grains from far-off places in an attempt to stabilize the economy. The crisis itself was caused by a domino effect of factors. Multiple cold and long winters combined with late frosts and heavy rainfall significantly damaged harvests and decreased growing seasons and caused crop failures across Europe. Combined with a multitude of other factors such as wars, export bans, and the interruption of trade thanks to extreme cold, food prices soared, which caused subsistence crisis and even famine across multiple regions. Rising mortality rates caused the European population to fall to the lowest point of the 15th century. The cold winters of the 1430s were without question unique compared to other decades. A 2015 study of seasonality in the 1400s was titled Endless Cold, in direct reference to this decade, which they called exceptional. A study of 1430s weather and climate concluded that high seasonality with cold winters and normal to warm summers is unique in the documentary and natural records. The exact cause of the extreme seasonality of the 1430s is not well understood. Various studies have tried to offer explanations like sunspots or ocean circulation. A 2016 study found that the harsh winters of the 1430s were merely the result of internal variation, meaning the natural variability and unpredictability of climate. And while 15th century Europe was unprepared to meet the crisis, the Bleak Midwinter of the 1430s did lead to several changes that would be important later in the coming Little Ice Age, notably the proliferation of the chimney. And this complex interaction between culture and economy and weather and its impact on history is exemplified in the various responses and impacts and reverberations that came at the time. And that is a lesson that we can still learn from, because while we cannot control the seasons, it is clear that the seasons still have some control over us. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.